Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual campus training session number 1 on legal rights, resources, and policies for LGBTQ+ student survivors of sexual assault. This training is being hosted by the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or MCASA for short. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Alyssa Garagiola. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm MCASA's Training and Community Engagement Policy Advocate. MCASA is a federally recognized state sexual assault coalition. We represent Maryland's 17 rape crisis centers and many other professionals throughout the state who work to respond to and prevent sexual assault. Before we begin, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items to make sure we're all on the same page. First, closed captions have been enabled. You can access them by going to the bottom of your screen and clicking on the closed caption button. Next, please take a moment to make sure your microphone is muted and stays muted throughout today's presentation. Today's training is being recorded. If you would not like to appear on camera during the recording, please take a moment to turn off your camera now. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves to your fellow participants. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please put those in the chat as well. We will do our best to answer your questions, and we will save any unanswered questions for a follow-up email. We'll also be doing different engagement activities during today's training, and we encourage you to participate with us in the chat. Towards the end of today's training, I'll be putting an anonymous evaluation link into the chat. We greatly appreciate all feedback as we are constantly striving to improve. If you're seeking a certificate of attendance, you must complete the evaluation form in order to gain access to the certificate request form. You can expect to receive your certificate in 4 to 5 weeks within completing the certificate request form. Finally, before we begin, I would like to provide a sensitive subject matter warning. Today's training may contain sensitive subject matter and may cause participants to experience strong emotional reactions. We encourage you to take care of yourself during today's training and reach out to your support networks for help if needed. And so with that, we'll get started with today's icebreaker. And I think someone already put some things in the chat. Feel free to please put an emoji, or you can do a Zoom reaction that represents how you're feeling today. These are awesome. Very good. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We are happy that you're here with us, and we'll go ahead on to the next slide for my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hello, all, and welcome. Thank you, Alyssa, for that introduction. My name is Stephanie Ertis, and I'm the Associate Director here at MCASA. And we are also joined by one of our colleagues from Sally. So, Dominique, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I am Dominique DeFries. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm the school policy staff attorney with Sally.
Great. All right, we're going to begin with our training today. So, legal rights, resources, and policies for LGBTQ plus student survivors of sexual assault. So, we've spent a lot of time this summer kind of talking about students and the LGBTQ community and how we can help those survivors. And really, what some of the rules and regulations and laws around sexual assault prevention and response, how they impact this community. So before we get started, we do have our funding disclaimer. So this training is funded by a couple of different grants. Some of it is state funding. VAWA 2024 is federal funding. And just a reminder that the opinions, findings, and conclusions expressed in this training are our trainers, are ours. They are not that of our funder. And I want to spend just a minute here talking a little bit about MCASA. So if anyone is a returner to one of our trainings, you may be a little bit familiar, but if you're new, the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault is the federally recognized state coalition. So all of the coalitions in the United States, or all of the states in the United States have a coalition. There are also some tribal and territory coalitions. And we are a collective voice for those sexual assault survivors and those that work with sexual assault survivors in the state. And you can see our mission on here. We work to help prevent sexual assault, advocate for accessible, compassionate care for survivors of sexual violence, and hold offenders accountable. As part of MCASA, we also have the Sexual Assault Legal Institute, and this is really unique to the Maryland Coalition, but they provide comprehensive legal services to survivors of sexual violence statewide, as well as do trainings like Dominique with us today, and provide technical assistance to professionals working with survivors. Technical assistance is MCASA's fancy word for expert advice. So you can talk to attorneys at Sally to get some expert advice on some of the laws we're going to talk about today, or other legal matters that you might be working with a survivor. And the easiest way to explain the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the Sexual Assault Legal Institute is to think of MCASA as a consulting firm for anyone who works with or is a survivor of sexual assault, and the Sexual Assault Legal Institute as a free law firm with comprehensive legal services for survivors. So, Dominique, I think you're going to run us through. Oh, no, wait. Yes, you are. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to you then.
Thank you, Stephanie. At the beginning of our presentations, we often like to remind people that MCASA and its member programs, such as the Sexual Assault Legal Institute, respond to all sexual assault survivors, regardless of individual characteristics. MCASA and Sally is also funded by VAWA and VOCA, which some of you in attendance, your programs might be funded by VAWA or VOCA as well. And VAWA funded grantees cannot discriminate based on actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. And additionally, VOCA funded grantees are required to comply with all applicable federal non-discrimination laws, which include all of those related to race, color, national origin, sex, religion, disability, and age.
Great. Thanks,
I'm going to turn
Dominique.
over to Alyssa, I think, now.
I think I'm going to do the poll question, and then we're going to talk about some learning objectives. So this is launching a poll for us. So this is definitely going to be an interactive presentation. We have a couple different times where you can respond in the chat. We have some Slidos for you. If you don't know what a Slido is, don't worry, we'll tell you. We have a video and we have some poll questions. So if you can answer this first poll question for us. So how familiar are you with the issues of sexual violence in the LGBTQ plus community? So you might be very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not at all familiar, and no answer here is wrong. So excellent. So we're going to end this poll and share our results with you so you can see them. So it looks like some of you are pretty familiar, which is great. We're so glad to have you on the call today so that you can share some of your expertise as we go through this training. Most folks are somewhat familiar. So you may have worked with a survivor that's in the LGBTQ community. You yourself may be in the LGBTQ community and be a survivor, or you might have had some other training. So we're glad to have you here to both grow some of your knowledge about this community and sexual violence, especially as it relates to students, but also for you to share some of your experiences. And there are some folks that are not familiar at all, which is great. We're glad to have you here so that we can all learn together. And with that, we'll get started with our learning objectives. So Alyssa, back to you.
Thank you. So by the end of this training session, you will be able to identify and use appropriate language when working with LGBTQ plus survivors, describe barriers to reporting sexual assault that all student survivors may face, as well as additional barriers that LGBTQ plus student survivors may face, identify and recall at least 3 legal rights and protections for student survivors, and specifically how those rights and protections apply to LGBTQ plus student survivors. And finally, analyze, assess, and improve school policies that address and prevent discrimination against LGBTQ plus students. So over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk a little bit more about sexual violence and the LGBTQ plus community. So to start off, I want to talk a little bit about some terminology. As many of you probably already know, when working with survivors, it's important to mirror the language that they use. So for example, if a survivor refers to themselves as a survivor or as a victim or something else, you want to mirror that language back to them. Additionally, when working with the LGBTQ plus community, you want to work to actively create an inclusive and welcoming environment. And this can be done by using appropriate terminology or language and avoiding outdated terms. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll go over a couple of these key terms to be keeping in mind. I do want to note here that this is a very small selection of identity descriptors for the LGBTQ plus community. If you're looking for a more expansive list, you could check out the Safe Zone Project or the Trevor Project. They both have really great resources and a broader list of identity descriptors. So to start off here, to go over just a couple of key terms when thinking about language. Sex or sex assigned at birth is basically based on our biology. So it's our chromosomes, reproductive organs, our physical body. So for example, someone may be assigned female at birth or male at birth. If someone has reproductive organs or physical body characteristics that are of both male and female, then they're assigned intersex at birth. Gender identity describes how someone views their own gender in the world. It's also how they express their gender identity to the world. For example, someone may identify as a girl or as a woman. Cisgender is when a person's sex assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity in the expected way for our society. So for example, if someone was assigned male at birth, and they also identify as a man, then their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity align in that expected way for our society. Sexual orientation is a type of sexual, romantic, emotional, spiritual attraction that someone feels towards another person. For example, heterosexual is an attraction to a gender identity that is different to one's own gender identity. Lesbian is a woman who is primarily attracted to other women. Gay describes people who are attracted to other people of the same gender, and it's also commonly used to describe men who are primarily attracted to other men. Bisexual describes a person who is attracted to another person of the same gender, and it can also describe someone who is attracted to one or more other genders. And asexual, this describes a person who doesn't feel any kind of sexual or romantic desire or attraction to any group of people. I do want to note here that this is different than celibacy. Celibacy is a voluntary choice to abstain from sexual activity. So again, with asexuality, this is when someone doesn't feel any kind of sexual or romantic attraction to another person. So again, with looking at this diagram here, this is just a very small selection of terms. If you're looking for a more expansive list, you can look into further reading on that. Next slide. All right, so now that we've gone over some basic terminology, I want to highlight some different statistics and dive a little bit deeper into the scope of sexual violence and the LGBTQ plus community. So this data here on this slide comes from the most recent National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. So this is the 2016-2017 report on victimization by sexual identity. So this data here looks specifically at the percentage of reported contact sexual violence among US women across the lifetime. I want to emphasize again that this is just reported data. These percentages are likely to be higher, considering those that have not made reports. So taking a look at the data here, about 4 in 5 bisexual women and a little over half of all lesbian women, and as well as a little over half of all heterosexual women in this report, reported experiencing some form of contact sexual violence. Now, in this report, contact sexual violence is defined as rape, men who are made to penetrate, sexual coercion, and or unwanted sexual contact. Next slide. So this data here comes from the same report as the previous slide, but taking a look at the rate of reported contact sexual violence among US men across the lifetime. So we see here over half of all bisexual and gay men, and about 3 in 10 heterosexual men reported experiencing some form of contact sexual violence in their lifetime. Next slide. All right, so this here is a couple of data tables. According to the Maryland Higher Education Commission's 2024 report on campus climate and sexual violence at Maryland colleges and universities. According to this report, 2,912 incidences of sexual violence were reported to Maryland's colleges and other institutions. Of this total number of incidences, over 92% of incidents were reported by Maryland's four-year institutions. So again, this data table here on the slide comes from this 2024 report, where data was collected between 2022 to 2024. And what I've done here on the slide to kind of break it down for you all is I've stacked two tables on top of each other so we can see the number of reported sexual assault and other sexual misconduct incidences along the top. And then we can also see the percentage of reported sexual assault and other sexual misconduct incidences along the bottom. Now, the reason I did this was because sometimes it's helpful to see the numbers so we can kind of quantify what we're actually talking about here. But it's also helpful to see the percentages so we can see proportionally what this actually means. Sometimes it's hard to tell how much a number is versus looking at the rate of something. So to further break down what these different incidences are, according to the report, sexual assault 1 incidences are defined as non-consensual sexual intercourse. So the report defines this as any act of sexual intercourse with another person without consent. Sexual assault 2 incidences are defined as non-consensual sexual contact. So this is defined as any intentional touching of the intimate parts of another person, causing another person to touch someone's intimate parts, or disrobing or exposure to another without consent. Other sexual misconduct incidences are included in this category if they relate to any category of violence or misconduct as defined by the institution. So some of the common types of violence that are found in this category include dating violence, domestic violence, sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, sexual intimidation, sexual violence, and stalking. And lastly, we have the unclassified incidences. So these are any incidences that cannot be classified by the sexual assault 1, sexual assault 2, or other sexual misconduct as reported to Title IX staff or other appropriate institution designees. So we see here, looking at the slide, that there were more reports of other sexual misconduct across community colleges, public four-year universities, and state-aided independent institutions compared to any other type of sexual violence that was reported. So this is a wide range of power-based violence incidences taking place on Maryland colleges and campuses. And again, I want to emphasize this is just the reported data. So these numbers are likely to be higher when considering the number of reports that were not actually made. So a couple of more statistics here for you to help further frame this up. According to the 2015 report on the Association of American Universities Campus Climate Survey on sexual assault and sexual misconduct, 60.4% of gay and lesbian students reported being sexually harassed, compared to 45.8% of heterosexual students. And 13.7% of gay or lesbian students, 25.3% of bisexual students, 18.6% of asexual or questioning students, and 10.8% of heterosexual students reported experiencing sexual assault involving physical force or incapacitation while in college. Next slide. I think I may have frozen. Sorry about that. Okay, am I back now? Can you all hear me?
Yep, you're back and we can hear you. Yep.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so just to wrap things up with the statistics, according to a study published in 2021 on LGBTQ plus student survivors' experiences with reporting sexual assault to Title IX, only 10% of LGBTQ plus students formally reported the incident to their college. So of those who made a formal report, 56% did so by communicating with a Title IX coordinator on their campus. 12.8% made a formal report to some other member of the college faculty. 21% made a formal report to some other college administrator, and 10% reported to a campus safety officer. Next slide. All right, so that was very heavy. Thank you for sticking with us. This is our first Slido of the presentation, so feel free to scan the QR code on the screen with a device, or you can go to slido.com and enter the pin here on the screen to answer this question. What are some reasons an LGBTQ plus survivor may not report a sexual violence incident to campus officials? And if anyone's having trouble accessing the Slido, feel free to put some answers in the chat. Or what are some reasons you think someone may not report? They may be embarrassed. Yep. It might out them. Yeah. Fear. You don't want your parents to find out. Yeah. Maybe you don't know what to do, don't know where to turn. Fear of retaliation. Yeah. Yeah, these are all really great. All right. Thank you all for participating in that. And over the next couple of slides, we're going to dive a little bit deeper. Oh, here's a few more. Don't know about available resources, fear of law enforcement, worries about not being believed. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. So over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk a little bit deeper on barriers that all survivors may experience when it comes to making a reporting, regardless of identity, as well as some additional barriers that LGBTQ plus student survivors may face. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some ways that we can eliminate these barriers. Next slide. So again, it's important to note that all survivors, regardless of identity, may encounter barriers to reporting. And some of you have named this on the Slido before. One of the common reasons a survivor may not report is out of shame or this stigma around being sexually assaulted, around being a victim. And this often is attributed to victim blaming. One of the tough things about overcoming victim blaming is that there's this deep belief in our society that the world is a fair and just place. So if something bad happens to someone who is good, then there's this psychological tendency to blame that person for the bad thing that happened to them. And this is known as the just world phenomenon, which feeds into victim blaming. And that's one of the symptoms of rape culture that is commonly present on college campuses. So again, this can influence things like whether someone actually makes a formal report of sexual assault. Survivors may also be afraid to make a report out of retaliation. Someone names that on the Slido as well. If the person who caused harm was a friend or a romantic partner, they may fear that there may be an escalation of violence or retaliatory violence due to the report. According to the National Crime Victimization Survey, which collected data between 2010 to 2016, In instances where the person who caused harm was a current or former partner, about 75% of all victimizations were not reported to law enforcement. Survivors may also be afraid to make a report if it was a coworker or a supervisor in the workplace, again, fearing retaliation, right? For example, if it did happen in the workplace and say they make a report, there may be this fear that they'll get a demotion or get passed over for a promotion or work more unfavorable shifts. Now, I want to be really clear here that it is illegal to retaliate against someone for making a report of sexual violence in the workplace. You can refer to, or survivors can refer to, guidance from the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, or MCCR, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, for some guidance on retaliation and reporting discrimination in the workplace. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact Sally. Dominique's contact information will also be at the end of the presentation today. So some additional barriers that I want to go over here, specifically for the LGBTQ plus community, come from a report published by the Williams Institute in 2015. According to this report, LGBTQ plus students, LGBTQ plus survivors may fear making a formal report about being sexually assaulted due to not wanting to out themselves, which was one of the things that everyone commonly put on the slide on the previous slide. There's also this additional layer of stigma and shame and fear of rejection that LGBTQ plus survivors may face, especially true if they're not out to their friends already or not out to their family. According to one study published in 2023, which asked LGBTQ plus student survivors why they didn't make a report, nearly 3 times as many LGBTQ plus student survivors as heterosexual student survivors said it was because they feared being blamed for the sexual violence happening. According to multiple reports, one from 2015, another from 2023, and another from 2025, LGBTQ plus student survivors shared another reason for not making a formal report was because of a lack of LGBTQ plus friendly or inclusive service providers available to them. And according to that 2023 study, LGBTQ plus survivors shared that one of the barriers to reporting was this fear that their sexual orientation or gender identity would become the focus of the investigation rather than the violence that actually happened. In the same study, LGBTQ plus survivors reported a fear of experiencing hate crimes based on sexual orientation or gender identity due to victim blaming culture that would come out as a result of making a report of sexual assault. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dominique to walk us through a scenario.
So this scenario is called Bobby's Story, and we'll be using it throughout the remainder of this training. So please feel free to take notes about it, and someone will also drop the full story in the chat so you'll have it and you can look at it. So I'll start by just kind of reading through it. So Bobby is a non-binary student, and they are sexually assaulted in their campus dorm room. When they try to seek help from their resident assistant, they are misgendered and become very closed off. A friend of Bobby's suggests they go to the counseling center at campus. The counseling center intake form only allows them to select male or female on the form. They feel misrepresented and decide to not complete the counseling intake process. Bobby then considers reporting the assault to campus police, but the first thing the police do is they ask for Bobby's student ID that has their dead name on it. So Bobby left without reporting. They also considered reporting to the Title IX office, but they were hesitant because stories they heard from other students that LGBTQ plus survivors' experiences are often minimized in the Title IX office. Bobby generally feels fear of being outed or facing backlash, and they are out to only a select group of friends, but not everyone on campus or their family at home. So I'd like you all to start thinking and dropping in the chat. What are some barriers you see in Bobby's story? And what is Bobby facing? Some barriers Bobby is facing to reporting sexual assault on their campus. And then maybe also think how might, if, Bobby was a student on your campus, what are some ways you might eliminate barriers to Bobby getting access to different services? And you can drop those in the chat. So I see not feeling understood. Yes, that's a big part of it, not feeling understood really with anyone, with other students or with the campus police or Title IX. Not feeling secure, yes, that as well. Not feeling respected. Yes, that's a big thing. Respected or acknowledged, just people acknowledging your identity and your story. I would say just also just not being able to access things like the forms at the counseling center. Yeah, not feeling included, only had male or female. There wasn't other options, so it seemed like maybe this counseling center didn't consider how their intake forms might impact someone's ability to access their resources. So yeah, I'd just like you all to continue thinking about different barriers. And as I said, this scenario we'll use throughout. So if you have any more comments you want to drop in the chat later, or when we go back to Bobby's story, feel free to do that.
So now that we've gone over a little bit of Bobby's story and thought about some barriers in that story, we're now going to focus on what are some ways you can eliminate barriers to reporting sexual assault on your campus for LGBTQ plus survivors. And if you don't work specifically on a campus, think about what are some ways that you can help to break down barriers as in your role, if you're a victim advocate at a rape crisis center or a victim advocate working with survivors on a college campus, what are some things that you can do to help eliminate barriers? Make sure that forms are inclusive. Yep. Advertise inclusion and acceptance. Yeah, spreading awareness is a big one. And again, if anyone's having trouble accessing the Slido, feel free to put it in the chat as well. Let's see. Ask pronouns, share your pronouns. Yeah. Is the ID required? Make sure that all faculty and staff are trauma informed and trained on inclusive language and protocols. Yes. Review language used in your forms. Maybe participate in trainings or provide trainings. Have a space that they know they can come to report and feel safe. Yeah. These are all really great. Well, thank you all so much. We can go on to the next slide. And now I'll turn it over to Dominique to take us through some legal rights and protections.
So now we're going to go over, as Alyssa said, some legal rights and protections. But first, I want to just do a brief, very brief Civics 101 because I know we have a very diverse group here, and I know there might be some terms you hear that I might mention, and I just want you all to know what they mean and how they're different. So we're going to go over 4 terms that people often hear when they discuss laws. The first term is statutes, and a statute, simply put, is a law. It is passed by Congress at the federal level or by the General Assembly at the state level. And these laws go through a legislative process, which means they are debated and discussed. They'll be voted on by like House or Senate, and then maybe signed into law after that rigorous legislative process. Next, we have rules or regulations, and these are often used interchangeably. Rules and regulations are not passed by lawmakers, but instead they are created by government agencies like the Department of Justice or the Department of Education. And agencies create these rules and regulations to get into the details or provide explanation on how a statute should be implemented. And sometimes the rules and regulations might provide steps for carrying out the statute's intent. However, a rule or regulation cannot contradict a statute. And if there is a conflict between the statute and a rule or regulation, the statute always takes precedent. So next, is a court decision or case law. So when a statute or a rule or regulation is challenged or not clear, a court can step in to interpret that statute or rule or regulation. And the decisions that the judges make, especially those from higher courts, such as the highest court in our land, the United States Supreme Court, set a legal precedent which other courts and agencies have to follow. And then lastly, there is guidance. Guidance is the least formal out of all of these terms. It is a statement an agency makes without going through any procedure. It is not legally binding and has no official process it goes through. It's more of, this is what you should do. Guidance is what it sounds like. It's supposed to guide you and say, maybe you should do this, maybe you should do that. Suggestions or best practices for carrying out a statute, but it is not the statute, not binding, and it's not rules or regulations. So next slide, please. So I understand that some attendees here today may not work in higher education, so I'm going to briefly explain what Title IX is. So Title IX is a federal law that's passed in 1972 that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any educational program that receives federal funding. So this covers most every colleges and a lot of K through 12 spaces as well. Many people, when they think of Title IX, the first thing they think about is women in sports, but it also is an instrumental statute in protecting students from sexual harassment on campus and discrimination in the educational settings. So now we have what is the 2020 Title IX regulations that are in place. And these are regulations that were put in place in January of 2025 under the current administration. It was 2024 regulations before, and we've reverted back to the 2020 regulations. So now, even though we have these 2020 Title IX regulations, which do not explicitly mention protections for LGBTQ plus students, that does not mean these students aren't protected on campuses. As I mentioned previously, Title IX prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, and many courts have interpreted that to mean on the basis of sex to include discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And in fact, the Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, department under the Department of Education, has enforced these types of protections even under these 2020 regulations. So that means the office has received complaints from different schools regarding violations of Title IX and has resolved the complaints to require the schools to protect students, LGBTQ plus students, from discrimination that was based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Next slide, please. So this is a case I want to just briefly cover, Bostock v. Clayton. It's a key Supreme Court case, and the decision illustrates kind of discrimination on the basis of sex. So in this decision, Mr. Bostic was fired for joining a gay softball league. And the court ruled that discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity is discrimination because of sex. So this was under Title VII, the employment statute. But because courts often read Title IX in line with Title VII, this reasoning extended to the education. So that means LGBTQ plus students are protected from discrimination in their educational programs because on the basis of sex has been interpreted by the courts to mean discrimination based on sex orientation or gender identity are similar identities. Next slide, please.
All right, so we want to hear from you all. How could Title IX help Bobby? So let's go back to that situation with Bobby. If you want to look at the specifics, they should be in the chat. You can access the PDF with Bobby's scenario on it. But to refresh, Bobby is a non-binary student that was sexually assaulted in their residence hall. They went to their RA and they were misgendered. They went to the counseling center and they only had male and female options on their intake form. They went to the campus police, but had to produce an ID with their dead name on it. And they thought about going to the Title IX office, but they had heard that the LGBTQ students that go to that office, sometimes their stories are minimized. So what are some ways, so put in the chat, or if you raise your hand, we'll take you off mute. What are some ways that Title IX and what Dominique just talked about could really help Bobby? How does Title IX protect Bobby and students in the LGBTQ community? Pulling up the chat right now. Provides confidentiality. Yeah, Leslie, absolutely. Confidentiality, it provides resources. For those of you that might have been, they cannot be denied service. So yeah, absolutely. Chantrella, thank you for that. So much like Dominique just said, for those of you that have been working with Title IX for a while, Title IX protects all students. And the case that she talked about really reinforces how a student's gender identity or sexual orientation cannot be used to discriminate. Some other things to think about when it comes to Title IX, feel free to keep putting stuff in the chat. Let me make sure participants aren't raising their hand. I want to make sure if there are. Okay. So some things to think about are it establishes a fair and equal process that includes LGBTQ students, even though they are not named in the 2020 regulations. And it protects against that retaliation. So you all identified retaliation as a barrier, and Alyssa also talked about it. So with this Title IX regulations, it protects students, including LGBTQ students, against retaliation. It gives students options through the Title IX process. Sure, absolutely. It does give them some options. And Dominique, I wanted to give you a chance too. So going back to the case, that has not yet to be overturned, right? That is still valid in the court.
As of now, it's still good law.
Great.
I hope it remains great. So yes. Yeah, so just some things. I'll just highlight a couple things I took note of when looking at Bobby's story is kind of the takeaway from Title IX and Bostic v. Clayton County is that schools cannot treat LGBTQ plus students differently or deny them services, as someone mentioned, or create any like barriers or obstacles because of their gender identity, or in Bobby's case, their non-binary status. So in practice, this could look like schools ensuring different forms are accessible, training staff. Some people mentioned the training process, providing equal access and resources to counseling, to reporting processes, and other supportive measures, and not misgendering or outing Bobby to anyone on campus or off campus as well.
Great. Dominique,
Let's
shall we move on to the next one?
go to the
Talk a
next
little bit
slide.
about. All right.
So let's talk about the First Amendment. This reminds me of a kind of middle school civics class a little bit. But the Constitution provides protections too to everyone, but specifically LGBTQ plus people have often focused on the First Amendment as a very important protection because it guarantees the freedom of kind of expression, usually under the freedom of speech or the freedom of press. So in Doe v. Eunice, it's a Massachusetts kind of case out Massachusetts, a high school student, in this case, not college, but a similar situation, was disciplined for wearing clothes that they found were gender affirming for them. The court ruled that punishing a student for clothing that aligned with their gender identity and their right to expression violated the student's First Amendment rights to kind of freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And for survivors, this matters because schools can't restrict expression of gender identity without risking possibly a constitutional violation of the First Amendment. So survivors who've experienced sexual assault, um, they have a right in the reporting process to go through that process as they are and be their full selves. So next slide, please.
So, what are some ways the First Amendment can help, Bobby? So, when we think about helping LGBTQ students on campus, there's several, we aren't confined to Title IX. There are other laws and other things, regulations that protect them. So, what are some ways that this First Amendment can help Bobby and other LGBTQ students? Again, put some stuff in the chat. Also, if you want to come off mute and talk, just raise your hand and we can bring you off mute. And you can share ways that you think that the First Amendment can help Bobby. We talked a little bit about like pronouns. So this definitely helps protect students from using their own pronouns. We would add here, I know this people have heard this a lot, but it's not really appropriate to call them preferred pronouns. This isn't a choice for someone who is transgendered or goes by pronouns different than were assigned to them at birth. These are just their pronouns. So this protects the First Amendment protects them from being able to use those. I know, Dominique, you had some other ways that you thought that this would protect students. So if you want to share some of those while people are dropping stuff in the chat.
So for Bobby, I think it really, if like the school administrators or staff, if they were misgendering Bobby or putting pressure on them to use their dead name or saying you have to select male or female or conform to this category as like a condition for reporting or for receiving some supports, these actions would go against kind of Bobby's right to freedom of expression. And so that's kind of where I see it going. That's my main one, I think. And then also just going back to refusing to use someone's correct pronouns or discouraging them could interfere with the constitutional right. But I think on a more general level, just someone's right to feel respected, to have dignity, to have kind of the support they need in the school environment, that could really create a hostile campus environment as well. So those are just some I kind of listed and thought through. I think
I
we
think
can go on to the next one.
I think the one I would add to that before we go on is about the right to assemble. So this protects the LGBTQ groups from assembling and getting together on your campus. So they are able to do that. And those groups can provide a lot of resources for survivors. Even if they are not a survivor group, they can find support there. That can be a space where, for those of you that might be working in prevention, you can go to that group and do special prevention programming or ask them about what they need when it comes to prevention programming. It's also a way to provide system advocacy for LGBTQ survivors. So when we think about the First Amendment, we also often think about the speech part of it or this press part of it, which is great. But there's this other part of it about assembling that allows LGBTQ groups or allied groups or GSA groups, Gay Straight Alliance groups, to get together and be that support system. And when you think about Bobby's scenario, with additional support from friends or mentors or other students that they meet in these groups, that could open up some resources for Bobby in their situation, or some support that they might need as they go through their own healing. So I think that that's one of the kind of fun things when we're thinking about looking at multiple laws that might help LGBTQ students. That's one of the ones that really connects with me, because I worked with college students for a long time before I worked at MCASA, and I did a lot of work with GSA groups and LGBTQ groups, and just working with them and finding space for them and places where they could really grow and feel comfortable, and spend a lot of time talking to them about what they needed. So I think that's an important part of this law too. So Dominique, back to you for FERPA. Anyone on a college campus is familiar with the term FERPA.
Sure. So, with FERPA, you think like privacy protections that we get under FERPA are very critical. And FERPA stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it allows students to kind of control their educational records and how they are disclosed. That includes personal information such as sexual orientation, transgender status, gender identity, and even a student's maybe former legal name. And FERPA can be a vital shield for many survivors who fear being outed to other members of the community. And so, some things I think about, I think we can go to the next slide because I think we're going to give some
Yep.
examples. We're going to
Yep.
connect FERPA. How could FERPA help Bobby? And you can drop things in the chat. But ones I just go right off the bat with is their non-binary status or their dead name. These can be protected educational records, so the school cannot just share those with others. They can't be put on like a student name roster or put out. The school cannot disclose this information through reports or student ID system. So Bobby's dead name as well as their non-binary status can be protected under FERPA. And if anyone has any other ideas or thoughts on that, please feel free to drop them in the chat.
The other context I would provide here while people are thinking of some ideas are students can kind of sign off on FERPA. And a lot of students will do this so that parents can get or guardians can get access to their financial information. So if your parents are paying, or if their parents are kind of working with banks on loans and stuff, they'll sign off on that. And I worked for almost 20 years doing orientation. And oftentimes we'd hit students up with this right away because we didn't want their parents to go away and be calling us 6 weeks later when their bills were due, like angry that they couldn't get into the students' records. So you want to make sure that if you're working with a survivor, you're understanding where, making sure they understand what FERPA is, making sure that they haven't kind of signed off that parents could get information, because that could be conflicting. And schools handle this in different ways. So universities have different ways to still use this for protection. The other thing I would say too, this isn't exactly FERPA, but if you're working with a survivor, it's also helpful to know, if they don't want their parents to know, what their parents may have access to. So for example, I used to email students a lot when I worked with student survivors. I would email them resources. I would email them various like appointment reminders, or if they missed an appointment and had to reschedule, we did it all through email, because typically you are the only person that has access to your email. So it was a really confidential way to do that. I did have a survivor whose parents checked her email, and so she did not want me to send anything through her email because her mom had her password and every day logged into her email account. And so regardless of how you may feel about that for a college student, I still did not want to out her as a survivor or out her as in the LGBTQ community. The name that they used was not the name that they used with me. Their name that I knew them by was not the name that their parents had given them, and not the name that their parents called them. So there was a really complicated confidential situation that I could have very easily breached and really put this person at risk with their parents, or their parents knowing information they didn't want them to if I hadn't communicated about what people might have access and permission for. And I see Leslie put in the chat too. This can give permission to parents. So some student survivors may want their parents involved, some of them may not. So as an advocate or a Title IX person, it's important to communicate with them who has access to what and how do they want to be communicated with. So that's just kind of a side note along with some of these FERPA protections.
So now I'm going to talk about some Maryland laws, and these laws just add more layers of protection for LGBTQ plus survivors and others. So, first one is a state law that prohibits discrimination in public accommodations, which includes establishments being restaurants, housing, or campus facilities based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The second one is the state's Trans Health Equity Act. So Medicaid now covers gender affirming care. And that went into effect last January, and it mandates coverage for medically necessary gender affirming treatments. Maryland also is a state that has 3 gender markers you could utilize when you go to the DMV. You can get male, female, or X, which is unspecified gender. And this can make it easier for students to have identification that, really reflects their lived identity. And having accurate ID can help reduce some of the barriers we talked about earlier to reporting sexual assault. And it can help survivors feel informed and affirmed and safe when they have to take out their ID for different things. Next slide, please. So there's other Maryland laws as well that go further. Maryland actually has a lot of great laws, I think, on the books. So the next one is a Maryland housing law, and it provides protections. Landlords cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity in decisions to rent, in rent prices, in making units available or not available. Additionally, hate crimes include assaults motivated by assaulting someone because they're LGBTQ plus, and so an assault on an LGBTQ plus individual because of their gender identity or gender expression or sexual orientation is considered a hate crime. That's not true in all states, but in Maryland it is, and that can add additional punishments if someone, for example, was sexually assaulted because of their gender identity. Someone chose to sexually assault someone, that could add enhancements there. And then lastly, an employer cannot treat an LGBTQ plus individual differently in hiring or workplace privileges. And these protections apply to student workers as well. So if a student is working on campus, they are also covered by this protection, as well as if they're working off campus, like at a restaurant or another establishment. Next slide, please.
So
So
how could go ahead, Dominique, go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead, please.
So let's talk about the Maryland laws. How can some of these laws maybe help Bobby or a similar student um, just overcome the barriers they might face or access different resources?
I want to address a question that came up about FERPA before we kind of move on. Catherine wrote, so if a student has signed FERPA, they can still change, rescind its permission, question mark. For example, removing their access to some or all of their records. So the best advice that we can give you is to check in with the university or the institution of higher ed that person goes to. There are some, the last I knew, there were some different ways that students, different options they had as far as signing away FERPA or signing away their FERPA privacies when it related to financial aid or academics or other things. There are also other areas that have confidentiality. So like Title IX may also, if they're funded by grants, they may also have their advocates or prevention programming folks may have some additional like confidentiality that isn't related to FERPA. Same thing with if there's a medical clinic on campus, they also have HIPAA stuff. So all of those play out differently depending on the university. So that would be the advice that I would seek out, is to find out what the specific FERPA regulations are on each campus that you might be working with. Dominique, anything to add to that? That's probably similar to some of your experience as well. It could vary from campus to campus.
Yes, Steph, I think you did a good job answering that. I'd say, yeah, check in with your campus and just see what their rules are. But I've definitely seen on campuses where you can change the permissions after.
Mhm.
Just as, you know, your life changes, you might want to change, maybe, especially at four-year institutions, maybe you want your parents on in the beginning, and as you get older, you just want to remove them for whatever reason, or you might get married or something might happen and you want to give different permissions. So, yes, check with your school or university.
Great. Um, all right. So I think just in wrapping up before we move on to school policies, just another reminder, and we were so lucky to have Dominique be able to break these down for this presentation, because I think the reaction when we went to the 2020 regulations after the 2024 regulations was, oh no, what will happen with our LGBTQ students? But this was a great assessment of other things that protect and help them. So sometimes we need to just think out of the box and stretch our minds into what is out there to help LGBTQ students. And we are going to move on to, so Dominique, anything else to add before I move on? I don't want to move on too quickly. Sorry.
No, I think again, just connecting back to Bobby's story, some things I put down that, you know, might help Bobby is the ID options that Maryland has. Just knowing there is the X marker option for a Maryland ID, our driver's license. Also, I was thinking Bobby was sexually assaulted in their dorm room. So if Bobby needs to seek a room change or safer housing after the assault, there are those housing protections. Let's say if Bobby was like living in off-campus student housing or something like that.
Great. So not only are there laws to protect LGBTQ students, but you can also have school policies and resources that can protect them as well. So Dominique's also going to talk about some school policies and some ways to use that tool to help protect LGBTQ students.
Yes. So, of course, laws, as Steph said, are only one part of the solution. School policies really should go beyond a lot of the laws we have. The laws set like a minimum, like Title IX should be seen as a floor or the baseline and not the ceiling. So schools can implement policies that require things like mandatory trainings for faculty and staff on um, pronouns and LGBTQ plus identities. They can also put policies in place that have ensure students feel safe on campus. They can conduct climate surveys and implement different changes based on what they might learn in a climate survey. These all can be proactive policies that, you know, tell students and LGBTQ plus survivors on campus that they are really valued and protected members of the community and of the campus. And so I think I think we're going to get into this a little later, but I think now is a good time to start thinking about what policies do your schools have already in place that help LGBTQ plus students or address their needs? And maybe where are there gaps where you could enhance your policies or maybe make changes to them so just everyone feels more accepted and included on the campus environment? Okay, next slide, please. Oh, right into the question. So, and this is a time where you could say policies your own campus has or ones you kind of could imagine that could help Bobby. So what policies, school policies could help Bobby access support and reporting resources? And let me see.
While people are thinking of those, I can answer Catherine's question about campus climate surveys. So if you're unfamiliar with that, campus climate surveys are surveys that the university puts out, and they really are designed to help it's a questionnaire. It's a survey for all students to fill out. Sometimes they're very specific to sexual assault or violence on campus. So they'll ask questions of students about their experience on the campus related to sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, and they'll collect that information. They're almost always totally confidential. Sometimes they will include other information. So they will ask students from what their experience is like on campus in general, usually relating to things like discrimination, oppression, equity, resources that are available to them. So campuses do them at varying times. Some of them do them every year, some of them do them every other year. And there is a survey. You got to see some of that data from the beginning of the presentation that the Maryland higher education organization does. So, and I think Alyssa just put some or no, Maddie just put some results in there. So MHEC, the Maryland Higher Education Commission or Council, I don't remember which one, they do campus climate surveys every year. So there's a report in there that you can take a look at. And Leslie just wrote that she believes they're every other year. I think the one from the commission, thanks Maddie for I always remember forget what the C stands for. I think that theirs is every other year. Some people might conduct them more often, but definitely there's that standard too. So yeah, so not to get us off track, but wanted to answer your question, Catherine. It looks like the next report is 2026. So yeah, thanks Maddie for adding that. So Dominique, back to you to talk more about policies. Sorry that I took that over.
No, that's fine. And thank you for answering that. I kind of had the chat hidden, so I didn't see it
Yeah.
at the moment. I just dropped in the chat as well, just some policies that I could think of while others are thinking about things. Again, inclusive forms, chosen name and pronoun policies on campus, staff, and in addition to staff like student leadership, I think RAs, presidents of clubs are different, student leadership roles, having them being trained as well. Um, inclusive, like, yeah, I think I listed the main ones I think of that a lot of campuses are starting to do. Does anyone who works on a campus have a policy that they think is really great or going really well and would be willing to share with the group? Maybe something they're trying out. And also you can raise your hand and we can take you off mute as well if that would be easier. Okay, well, does anyone have a policy they don't think is going well? I mean, I was hoping there'd be some positive things. I think, a lot of schools in Maryland are doing a pretty good, job. Um, but does anyone see any policies that they've seen or heard about that they would like to have changed? Maybe your school has a form that isn't super inclusive. You're thinking, we need to change that. Or maybe there's a group that you haven't been able to train, and that could be something You all start now. I think I covered the main ones in the chat. So if there's no like comments or ideas, we can move on to the next one. And of course, if any of you come up with anything later, please feel free to drop it in the chat, um, or just raise your hand and come up. So next slide, and I think it's Alyssa now.
Yep, thank you. So the next couple of slides, we're going to go over some resources that can help you and your schools kind of assess your policies. And you can use these to adapt your policies or revise your policies as needed. So this first one here is called the LGBTQ Friendly Campus Pride Index. This was developed in 2001 by national LGBTQ researchers in response to an increasing demand for tools and resources to support campuses assessing LGBTQ-friendly policies, programs, and practices. Now, I've listed on the slide here some of the criteria that's used to score a campus's policies, programs, and practices in the index. I do want to note here that the Campus Pride Index defines LGBTQ friendly as environments that are inclusive, welcoming, and respectful for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning people. This index relies on campus officials to assess their colleges using self-assessments and reporting information about their school's campus environment. So if people go to the Campus Pride Index, they can search up a school and see its score will pop up. They'll see the different criteria, how the school scored in each of these criteria. And I bring this up because it can also be used as just an internal tool. Even if a university is not going to participate in the Campus Pride Index, they can use the criteria to assess internally where their policies are in terms of being inclusive and welcoming. Next slide. And so here we have a couple of different sample forms and ideas to make intake forms more inclusive. So these would likely be really helpful in Bobby's case with the counseling center. The first link here goes to a web page called Queering Medicine. And so it's more particular for health centers, but some of the formatting can be adapted to registrar's office or counseling centers. One of the cool things about that, the first link here, is that it shows different formats for collecting like demographic data, as an example. So it uses the check all that apply format, free response format. So like in Bobby's case with selecting the gender, either female or male, that excludes Bobby. With a check all that apply approach or a write in your response approach, it's automatically more inclusive. And the second bullet point here shows additional ways to create inclusive campus surveys, again, medical forms for health centers, record-keeping documents, and it also provides additional information and resources. I do want to note here that this second bullet point, the resource here comes from the Consortium of Higher Education for LGBT Resource Professionals. Next slide. So some more guides here on creating non-discriminatory school policies. The first bullet point here was created in 2020 by GLSEN and the National Center for Transgender Equity. This guide was originally created for K through 12 schools, but some of the policy recommendations in here may be applicable to post-secondary schools as well when thinking about non-discriminatory language when we're writing school policies. The second link here is a model on how to use inclusive pronouns and challenge gender norms. And this was published in 2024 by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the third link here on the slide is just guidelines on creating inclusive syllabi in classes. And this was created by University of Connecticut's Rainbow Center. Next slide. And then wrapping us up with just some additional policy resources. So the first bullet comes from Bryn Mawr College, published in 2022. It's about a 2-page guide just on asking students for their pronouns, what to do if you happen to make a mistake, if you accidentally call someone by the wrong pronouns, how do you pivot? Simple answer is just apologize and then try to do better. You don't want to draw extra attention to it. And then the second link here is a guide on creating more inclusive language in email signature lines, professional biographies, maybe on the school website, and other guides as well. And this was published in 2018 by Vanderbilt University. So this is just a selection of some resources that we've found. And again, if anyone has any ideas or things that they do at their university and you're willing to share in the chat, that would be really amazing. And you'll, again, be receiving a copy of these slides later after the presentation. So you can click on these different links and check them out. Next slide. So now we're going to watch this brief video clip. This is a 2018 TED Talk called LGBT Queering the Narrative of Sexual Violence. And this is presented by Dr. Paige Lee Baker Braxton, who is a clinical psychologist who specializes in LGBT mental health and trauma. Dr. Baker Braxton is going to share a story that highlights the importance of using pronouns when working with LGBTQ plus survivors and how it really can either eliminate barriers or create barriers if you're not using someone's pronouns. I do want to note before we start that this is just a small clip of the full YouTube video. We clipped it for the purposes of this training. The full video is searchable on YouTube. You can go ahead and play it.
So over the course of my career, I've had the privilege of sharing in the healing journey of hundreds of queer survivors of sexual violence. And their stories are unique and complex and punctuated by resilience. But today I'm going to share just a small part of one person's story, a person I'm going to call Rain. Rain was a queer trans woman of color in her early 20s that moved to Chicago because Chicago offered this queer utopia, this opportunity to go by her pronouns, her chosen name, and be surrounded by people that not only validated her identities, but shared them. Rain came to see me about a year after moving, presenting with high levels of anxiety. In our work together, it became clear that she was experiencing significant violence in her intimate relationship. Rain's live-in partner would threaten to out her at work, repeatedly said hurtful and harmful things about her body, and again, over and over, told her that no one would ever love her because she was trans. All of this was a means to manipulate, force, and coerce Rain into sex that for her was never consensual. But Rain never called these experiences rape or sexual assault because they were normalized by friends who shared similar experiences and invalidated by her family that loved this partner and couldn't imagine them causing this much harm. So the work Rain and I did centered on consent, safety planning around the violence, and finding ways just to help her make it through the day. And we were making real progress. That was until Rain got a new job that required her to take the train to work. She used to tell me that day after day on that train, people would say horrible transphobic things about her body or would touch her inappropriately. I remember her so clearly telling me, when I am on that train, my body doesn't belong to me, it belongs to them. And then Rain was raped at a party. She woke up not remembering exactly what happened, but knew something in her body did not feel right. So like the good survivor, she went to the hospital for a rape kit. And when she checked in, the receptionist was unable to gather her pronouns or chosen name in the medical record. And what that meant is when she was called back, when it was her turn, she was called by her dead name. Her dead name is the male name assigned at birth, the name that doesn't fit for who she is, the name that invalidates every core of her being, the name that causes her harm. But Rain swallowed that pain, mustered the courage, and went back to the exam room where she crawled on the table next to that scratchy gown. She looked down at her wrist to the medical ID bracelet that so boldly pronounced her dead name. Yet another reminder of her invisibility in a system designed to protect and support survivors. And then Rain overheard the nurse say, "We have a code R in exam room 3. He wants to do a rape kit, so we have to call the police. But before we do, does anyone know how to do a rape kit on him? You know, on someone like him?" And with that, Rain's anxiety mounted so high she panicked and fled the emergency room without the care she not only needed, but deserved and was her right. Rain's friends and family did not speak her language when they didn't understand the sexual abuse in her relationship. The medical system literally did not speak her language when they were unable to capture her pronouns or chose a name in an electronic medical record. And the nurse certainly didn't speak her language when the nurse continued to misgender her and felt unprepared to do a trans-competent rape kit. Rain was pleading and begging for help from systems, institutions, and people that did not speak her language. They spoke the language of the white, straight, female survivor. I hope that Rain's story demonstrates that the language we have that dictates our programming and how we talk to and about survivors is not just incomplete and insufficient, but it causes harm. So in order to end sexual violence for all people, we need to learn Rain's language.
I think that was a really powerful example of why we are in this training today, why we're talking about how we're eliminating barriers through noticing our laws and policies and looking at different resources to help us revise our policies so they're anti-discriminatory and supporting LGBTQ plus student survivors. Steph or Dominique, is there anything you want to add about this?
I think the only thing I would add is one of the reasons we chose this story is though even though Rain is not identified as a college student, they are identified as a young person in a new environment. And so I think that there are many parallels between this story and what some of the students you are working with may experience, moving to a new place, being excited to be in a place where you can go by your name and your pronouns and feel accepted and be related be relating to and talking to other people that share your identity and some of those experiences. So I do think that this speaks to some of what we were talking about. And I think we have one final activity to sum everything up. And Dominique, I think it's to you for that, right? Yep.
Yes, it is. Are we just gonna go through it? Are we gonna do how are we feeling about it?
I think we're getting near the end. Go ahead, Alyssa. Go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing. I think we're getting near the end,
Okay.
but if you want to read over it and people can think
Yes.
about it.
So I'm going to read over this, and again, you'll have this in the chat as well. So this is something you can take back to your colleagues and discuss, or just kind of sit and ponder with yourself, kind of what we did with Bobby's story. So now I'm just going to read through Jasmine's story. So Jasmine is a 21-year-old student who identifies as a cisgender lesbian. At an on-campus party, she is drugged and sexually assaulted by a male student. She decides to file a complaint with the Title IX office. And Jasmine is concerned, though, because the Title IX intake coordinator is asking her a lot of questions. When Jasmine asked if their conversation would be kept confidential, the intake coordinator stated that some information would be shared on a quote unquote need to know basis. Jasmine feared that this may mean she would be outed to others. Jasmine wanted to share a semi-fictional piece in a school paper, which included the lack of services available to LGBTQ plus survivors on campus, and also about her sexual assault. Her post was up on the virtual school paper, but it was abruptly removed without explanation. A school dean reached out to meet with her about improper student behavior, the posting of this piece in the school paper. Jasmine feels very disconnected and her grades started to drop. She struggles to wake up on time for class, and her friends tell her about an LGBTQ plus survivor support group offered at their school in Miami. But Jasmine's school is in Maryland and they do not have an LGBTQ plus survivor support group. So I just want you kind of thinking as we kind of close out today, um, kind of some things you see in Jasmine's story, where some barriers that Jasmine is facing, how maybe could her school create policies that are more inclusive, how could different laws maybe help her get the support or help her report in the way she needs to? That could be through the Title IX office, that could be a police report, that could be going to the counseling center. So this is just a scenario I want you to think about. You can put some things in the chat, or you can just take this with you and look at it whenever you have some free time, as I said, by yourself or with some colleagues, and just kind of think about how Jasmine's story and Bobby's story, these these could be students on your campus, or if you're not on campus, these could be young adults in your community, um, going through very similar situations. And how are you going to use kind of what you've learned today and maybe what you learn going forward, to make students or young adults like Jasmine and Bobby feel safe, connected, and have dignity in your community or on your campus. So next slide. We have some just supplemental resources and additional information. As Alyssa said, we will share this out with you all. And so you can click on all the links. But there's some links we have about Know Your Rights through the ACLU. They have a good web page. GLAD Law also has a good resource for legal advocates and defenders. The Consortium of Higher Education LGBT Resource Professionals have a really great PDF with additional resources, and Forge Forward is also and has an agency checklist or self-assessment tool where you can kind of assess how your department or your agency, how inclusive it is, and kind of follow the checklist and see where there are gaps that you could work on. Next slide. And then these are just some local and state resources we have, phone numbers and websites included, but Free State Justice is a great resource. Baltimore Safe Haven, Pride Center of Maryland, Trevor Project. You can also, on the other side, MCASA's Sexual Assault Legal Institute, or Sally, we are always willing to take calls or questions with technical assistance questions. If you have some questions about how your policies could be changed or want some just legal advice, we can offer that through TA. And as well as I said, this will all be available to you, and you will have these links to just go and access at your leisure. Next slide. Okay, I guess that is all. Well, thank you all for participating. Are there any questions or comments about what you've learned today? Also, yes, please fill out the anonymous evaluation form. That is in the chat.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now. So as we've mentioned, you'll receive a follow-up email with a copy of today's video recording, the PowerPoint slides, and the evaluation link. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us directly. You can also respond to my follow-up email, and if there are questions specific for Dominique, I'll make sure she gets those. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it back over to Steph to talk about an upcoming training.
Yeah, just in our last minute here, you are getting a sneak preview. This is the first of a series of 6 virtual campus trainings that we will be hosting from September to all the way through next spring. So 3 during this semester and 3 in the spring semester. We are in contract negotiations with our next presenter, so that's why there isn't a registration available. But we are trying to put together a virtual campus training on emerging issues in digital safety and sexual violence on campus. So you're getting a sneak preview that is coming in early October. So watch your email, watch our website, and we will hopefully be posting about that soon. We're hoping to be hosting that with NTAB and sexual abuse online. So, and sexual and technology abuse. That's what it stands for. Sorry for that blunder. So hopefully we will see you at that next month. We'll see you at that virtual campus training. And again, if you have any questions, please share them. And otherwise, we will see you. Oh, I did want to thank, this has been a great experience presenting with Alyssa and Dominique. We're glad to have kicked off this series, and hopefully we will see you all again soon.